all for coming to the Art of Creative Nonfiction, or it has many names, but that's one name. At least you'll hear more tonight. I'm Marcia here from Portage District Library, and I want to introduce someone from our sister library, Kalamazoo Public Library, who's going to tell us a little bit more about maybe reading together and some other things. Karen Santa Maria.
Hi. Just want to take a couple of minutes to thank you all for coming and participating in the Reading Together program this year. We only have a few more programs coming up, a couple of next week and a couple the following week, and then as you all know, Deo Gracias will be at Kalamazoo College in May. But I just wanted to draw your attention next week on Tuesday, April 5th, a tour of world literature. That's at 6:30 p.m. at the Washington Square branch of Kalamazoo Public Library. And the following week, Tuesday, April 12th, Refugee Resettlement, a local story of a Rwandan mother and son who came to the Portage area and how Portage United Church of Christ helped them make their new home. And so that's where that will be happening, at Portage United Church of Christ at 6:30 on April 12th. And I have some surveys that I would love to have you fill out at the end of tonight's program, if you wouldn't mind. So I'll hand those out later. Thanks.
Thanks, Karen. We do have Reading Together flyers. These are wonderful. If you've read the book or haven't read the book, it has information about Tracy Kidder, about these programs, the addresses of how to get to the different venues. It's wonderful. Kikyo did a great job once again of putting it all together. So those are on the back table, as well as some author visits that are going to be happening here at the library in April, and in May we're going to be bringing Nancy Eimers and Bill Olson here for a poetry reading, and also Jamie Gordon, who probably most of you know won the National Book Award, is coming in May. So all those commercials are on the back table if you'd like to take one when you get your cookie. As Karen said, this is part of the Reading Together program, and the reason we decided to do this was because Tracy Kidder is really well known for his, I have to get this right, he has literary journalism or narrative journalism, and Cathy's going to talk a little bit more about that on our panel. And the way you choose somebody to tell a story that's even bigger than them, but you understand the story that's even bigger than them through their stories. And we're going to talk again a little bit more about that. And everybody that's on this panel has written a book and teaches that. We're so lucky that we have this wealth of information here in Kalamazoo and Portage. And let me tell you who's going to help us through this discussion of creative nonfiction. We have Gail Griffin, and most of you know her. She is a distinguished professor of English at Kalamazoo College. She's a poet, an essayist, the author of 2 volumes of nonfiction, actually more than that, but Calling, Essays on Teaching in the Mother Tongue, and Season of the Witch, Borderlines, Martial Notes. And her most recent book is called Events of November, Murder, Suicide, October. Yes, it had to get in. It's on the fall. Well, it resonated into November. Events of October, I'm sorry. Murder, Suicide on a Small Campus. And if you haven't read that, it is amazing, but put aside months to get over it. It's very compelling and very powerful. Cathy Jasmine is an author and professor at Western Michigan University, and she has been here and discussed several of her books, one of which is Edith Wharton and the Making of Fashion. She's also written Jane Addams, A Writer's Life, and Wretched Exotic Essays on Wharton in Europe. She's currently writing a biography, would you call that, or a memoir of Theodore Roosevelt, and Birdsongs. And she's going to tell you more about that coming up, but it's very fascinating. Cathy Genesis is a very good friend. She's current writer and editor for Southwest Michigan Second Wave, an online business magazine. She's a poet, a journalist, a freelance writer, and she has taught journalism at Kellogg Community College. So what we thought we'd do is just have the panelists talk a little bit about their concept of creative nonfiction, how they might teach it, how they incorporate it in their writing, And then we'll let them all go through and then have questions at the end, and there'll be plenty of time to do that. So, yeah, whoever wants to go first.
All right. In the late 70s and 80s, one of the reasons people moved to the city of Novi was for the schools. Millage renewal votes passed easily. People believed their teachers were the best in the Detroit metropolitan area. In 1982, a disagreement between the teachers' union and school board over a new contract provoked a strike. The Novi School Board voted to fire its striking teachers. A school board meeting in the middle school gymnasium filled with angry parents and distraught teachers. In this environment, the school administration offices were vandalized and a small fire was set and quickly extinguished. A longtime wrestling coach, a beloved teacher, was one of the vandals. When his involvement came to light, I talked with the coach. The story I wrote started out with a description of the rows of awards and trophies in his basement, the number of wrestling teams he led to championships. It talked about his tears as he described what happened that night, and there was his quote about how it felt like the school board had ripped out his heart and stomped on it the night they voted to fire the teachers. In the ensuing 30 years since I wrote those words, the faded clipping has been misplaced, so I can't read it to you tonight, but it's probably as close to creative nonfiction as I've gotten. I wondered, is the story creative nonfiction just because it starts out with a description instead of a straight telling of the facts? Probably not. It's more like a feature treatment of a news story. Yet as I learned more about this elusive animal called creative nonfiction, I realized in my career I've used elements of it more than I at first believed. And I sense more keenly what it is that attracts journalists and repels them at the same time. As writing coach Chip Scanlon says, creative nonfiction as opposed to uncreative nonfiction. Journalists think of themselves as writers, and by that we want to imply creative. We write nonfiction, which has limits, strict limits. One of my newsroom friends described writing this way as the quickest way to get you fired. And there are plenty of journalism scandals to prove her right. Even so, the attraction is that so much of what journalists write is formulaic. The formulas are important. When deadline is ticking in your head, you need to be able to rely on a formula to make sure all the elements of the stories are there. The formulas are decades old. One of the most commonly used is the inverted pyramid. Think of a pyramid and turn it upside down. In this formula, the most important information is at the top of the story. The details become less and less important as the story continues. This story doesn't have a beginning, middle, and end the way we think of other storytelling. It simply ends when all the facts are told. The journal myth is that this style was developed during the days of the first telegraphs. When reporters filed their stories, they could never be sure how long the telegraph service would be up, so they wanted to make sure all the important stuff was at the top. Later, that formula allowed editors to fit long stories into short holes simply by cutting off the end, the part with the least important facts. Who, what, when, why, and how are reported at the top of the story. Write stories that way a few dozen times, and suddenly anyone who considers themselves at all creative is looking for a more engaging way to tell a story. And that's what attracts journalism to creative nonfiction. Editor Rick Zoller at the Seattle Times says, the traditional version of the 5 W's freezes the story elements into informal ice cubes. If you thaw them out, the narrative begins to flow. Who becomes character? What becomes action? Where becomes setting? When becomes chronology? Why becomes motive? How becomes narrative? And Zoller gives this example. One of the great reporters of his day was Meyer Berger of the New York Times. He won a Pulitzer in the late 1940s for his narrative reconstruction of a multiple shooting. He wrote it on deadline and at great length. But he also was a master of the short human interest feature. In 1959, he wrote a story, about 1,200 words, on an old, poor, blind man who was once a classical musician. Then he wrote a sequel. 8 violins were offered the other day to Lawrence Strutz, the 82-year-old cataract-blinded violinist who was taken from a Bowery flophouse to St. Clair's Hospital in East 71st Street. The authors came from men and women who had read that though he had once played with the Pittsburgh Symphony Orchestra, he had been without a violin for more than 30 years. The first instrument to reach the hospital was a gift from the Lighthouse, the institution for the sightless. It was delivered by a blind man. A nun took it to the octogenarian. He He played it a while, tenderly and softly, then gave it back. He said, "This is a fine old violin. Tell the owner to take good care of it." The white-clad nun said, "It's your violin, Mr. Strutz. It's a gift." The old man bent his head over it. He wept. In 145 words, Berger turned a traditional who, the 82-year-old cataract-blinded violinist, into a real character, a real human with real human emotions. This example, presented by Roy Peter Clark from the Journalism Training Ground for Poynter Institute, was written long before people talked about creative nonfiction. Lee Gutkin, editor and founder of the journal Creative Nonfiction, believes he coined the term and says it became official in 1983. The National Endowment for the Arts was meeting to decide who would get its fellowships and needed a name for a category of creative writing that was not poetry or fiction. Eventually, one of the NEA members in the meeting that day pointed out that a rebel in his English department was campaigning for the term creative nonfiction. That rebel was Gutkin. Gutkin offers this description of the genre he named. Although it sounds a bit affected and presumptuous, creative nonfiction precisely describes what the form is all about. The word creative refers simply to the use of literary craft in presenting nonfiction, that is factually accurate prose about real people and events in a compelling, vivid manner. To put it another way, creative fiction writers do not make things up. They make ideas and information that already exists more interesting and often more accessible. What Gutkin doesn't say is the problem is some creative nonfiction writers do make things up. They squeeze time frames, they manipulate quotes, they create scenes to fit their narrative flow. The quickest way to get you fired. To tell a story the right way, the one where you keep your job, takes details, mountains and mountains of them. That takes time, and journalists who do take the time to get it right, or don't take the time to get it right, are going to get in trouble. The ones who get it right have different ways of getting the details they need. Most of the successful journalists in this genre get them by immersing themselves in the subject. They dig into public records, information immersion, they go undercover, or they live with their sources. They take jobs in the field they're covering. Think George Plimpton's season in the training camp with the Detroit Lions for his book, The Paper Lion. Some writers spend years researching their subjects painstakingly to get the intimate details and thorough understanding of the subject that makes immersion worth the effort. Tracy Kidder is one of these. He spent a school year with a group of fifth graders in an impoverished school district for his book, Among School Children. He chronicled the construction of one of the first mini supercomputers for his Pulitzer Prize winner, The Soul of a New Machine. And he followed Paul Farmer, a doctor devoted to curing infectious diseases on a global scale for mountains beyond mountains. Kidder writes, and I think he affirmed this when he was here, "I believe in immersion in the events of a story. I take it on faith that the truth lies in the events somewhere, and that immersion in those real events will yield glimpses of that truth." Kidder told the Pittsburgh Tribune-Review why he practices immersion. "I try to write stuff that's factually accurate, but I like to tell stories, and that's the way I try to get it. It's where everything begins and ends for me." He's not keen on the label creative nonfiction. It suggests you make it up, I suppose, and there are things you do make up, but you don't make up facts. What does he make up? Well, you have to figure out how to tell any story, whether it's fiction or nonfiction. One of the things you have to do is figure out where you stand to tell your story. I think you have to do a lot of the same things you do in fiction. You have to cultivate a voice. You have to find in the material itself the right way to tell a story. Then he goes on to describe his work in a way that those who do like the term creative nonfiction would be entirely comfortable with.